Well, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, as you can see, we're out and about in the fresh air for the very first time of asking in 2024, and today we've made the 180-mile journey south from Scotland to Milnthorpe in Kendal to cover the 2024 Kendal Classic Revival Scramble. Now, this event here, of course, is hosted by the very well respected Westmoreland Motor Club, who have been putting on scrambles, trials and even hill climb events in and around this area for many years. So when it comes to putting on one of these classic scrambles, then these Westmoreland guys certainly know how to put it all together. Now, hopefully we will have at least 24 races to look forward to on the Sunday, and we'll have racing classes from the vintage pre-65 bikes right up to the relatively modern bikes of the pre-1984 or twin shock class. So quite a lot of racing to get through on the Sunday. Now, this is of course Saturday, mainly set-up day, so it's a chance for everybody to get things ready for the big day tomorrow. Now, as opposed to the weather forecast, now we've had quite a wet spell in and around the UK in the early spring, and the forecast for this weekend is said to be quite good for this area, so hopefully we'll not see any rain and we'll see some fantastic racing on the racetrack. But for the time being, we're going to take our first walk of two Paddock walkabouts and take a look at some of those very nice machines that are soon to take part in this 2024 Kendal Classic Revival Scramble.
Right, so we're going to kick off this part one of our Kendal Classic Revival Scramble walkabout by first taking a look at Chris Lewis's quite nice 1974 CR250M Honda Elsinore. Now, they do say that there were over 220 entries for this year's Revival Scramble, so despite the slight downturn in enthusiasm for classic racing this year, this revival event never seems to have any problems attracting riders and spectators to come along to this vintage spectacle. So as you can imagine, there were quite a lot of bikes to get through as I wandered around the paddock, and the Fures was one that you would have liked featured on this video. Then certainly my apologies to you for not getting to it, but there was just far too many bikes to get through this year in such a short space of time. So this particular Honda Elsinore of Chris Lewis's, as you can see, is not fully original from that particular year, and this ignition side casing has been replaced, and this part probably would have been made of magnesium back in the day, but it's now been replaced by this superbly engineered CNC machined alloy side casing with, of course, that nice Honda engraving on the side. Now, the CR250 motors are, of course, a single cylinder two-stroke, and when these bikes came out in, I think it was 73, these were absolutely awesome power plants, and Honda were actually selling these bikes before they'd even made them. Such was the demand. But you can see here at the front end of Chris's bike that the triple clamps have been replaced, and I think the forks on this bike could possibly be up-rated items as well. But it's certainly not unusual to see these little Elsinores with upgraded parts fitted onto them, because very few original Elsinores now survive when you consider these were made back in 1974, but it's a good thing that these guys are still keeping these little Elsies on the track, because these are still very highly competitive little machines, even though these are just the smaller 250s. But on the back again of Chris's bike, you can see that he's replaced the original shocks with a nice pair of modern style Maxton units, and these Maxton shocks are beginning to get quite a good name for themselves, and these are quite popular suspension units on these old classic bikes. But of course these suspension units will be a million times better than the original Honda items. And again here at the front we have the traditional CR Elsinore front mud flap, which was quite a common sight on these LCs away back in the 1970s, but an alloy tank, of course. This one painted with the red stripe. I think the earlier ones, the 1973 LCs, had the green stripe down the middle, but this is a cracking looking little bike, and don't forget to look out for Chris's bike racing when we eventually get round to posting the racing footage, because this is a seriously quick little bike, and quite trick as well when you see it there with that new alloy casing and of course that replacement alloy swing arm as well. Now, just sitting next to Chris Lewis's Elsinore was Andy Hinchcliffe's lovely 1973 380 CZ. Again, this of course is not a fully original bike, because as I said before, many of these old classic Hondas and CZs aren't original these days, but there's so many different parts and upgraded bits and pieces that you can buy for these CZs nowadays, and riders tend to change suspensions and engine parts just to make the bikes a little bit more easier to ride on the track. And in this shot here you can take a look at that 380 CZ two-stroke motor, fitted of course with a modern style Mikuni carburetor rather than the original Czechoslovakian Zhikov carburetor that would have been on this engine back in the day. But these were super quick, these big 380s, and a bit noisy when they got started, but these engines could certainly motor when you got them going. It looks like Andy's not gone for the traditional upgrade on the gear shifter mechanism on this bike. There is a remote gear shifter mechanism available for these engines now, which makes the throw of that gear shifter not as big, and it makes the gear changing a lot more slicker and much more like a Japanese bike. But looks like Andy's decided just to stick with the old original traditional gear shifter. And you can also see that this clutch casing has had some kind of coating on the outside, probably Cerakoting or something similar, because this casing would just normally be kind of like polished alloy. Up at the front we have a few more upgrades on these lovely billet alloy CNC machined triple clamps, and it looks like Andy's also put a pair of bar risers on there to mount those Renthal handlebars. But certainly our particular 380CZ has the stock standard CZ front suspension, which I expect will have maybe some work done on their internals. But again, the standard CZ front brake, which for their day, these drum brakes on these old Czech CZs were pretty good for the 1970s. And once more here at the back end of Andy's CZ, The original Czechoslovakian suspension units have been removed, and a nice pair of modern style gas filled shocks have been put in their place. Now, I don't actually know the make or manufacturer of these shocks, but you can almost guarantee that these will be a hell of a lot better than the stock originals that were fitted at the CZ factory back in '73. Once more, the fuel cell on these CZ was an alloy fuel tank, and I think that seat again has also had some reupholstering to make it a bit more comfortable. But as I said, the bars on the front of this bike are not the stock standard CZ bars, which is not unusual to find on one of these old classics, because, as I said, there's lots of different parts that you can buy for these old Czech racers to make them a bit more user friendly on the track. But again, certainly look out for this bike taking part in the racing footage when I eventually get round to posting it, because Andy will be racing this bike here in the pre-74 over 250cc class. But again, another belter of a Czech racer from Andy Hinchcliffe. Now, of course, it wasn't just the bikes that were on display at this year's Revival Scramble. There were some top-class celebrities coming as well, and this man here on the left, pictured next to Peter Remington, is the great legend Freddy Maz, who was the 250 British motocross champion in 1966. And Freddy flew halfway across the world to be at this event on the Sunday. And another British racing legend that was at this year's Revival Scramble was the great Alan Clough, who was again one of the old British motocross stars from the 1950s and 60s. And it was great to have a little chat with Alan once again this year. But as we get back to the bikes again, now our next featured example is this 1977 AW 400 Michael belonging to John Kemp. And I remember John was telling me that he's only just recently bought this bike from, I think it was Phil Drabble he bought the bike from, who also has quite a good collection of old classics in his possession. But of course, this bike here of John's is not a fully stock original bike from 1977. It does have an actual replacement fuel tank on it, because John told me that the fuel tank on this bike when he bought it was brand new and it hardly had a scratch on it, so he decided to take it off and put this replacement fuel tank on just to save that nice tank from being damaged. But another cracking looking old Adolf wheel 400 Michael. And John's particular Michael was fitted with this 400 piston port engine, two-stroke of course, with that big Bing carburetor there to feed it with its fuel. And the big Bing carburetors of course were the standard fitting on many of these AWs during the 1970s. But Adolf Wheel, the German motocross star, certainly had some big successes riding these bikes back in the day. A couple of other upgrades here on John's machine with these nice stainless steel wide foot pegs and that replacement alloy rear brake pedal lever. Now, the exhaust on John's bike is a Dutch-made replacement, and this is a much better exhaust than would have been fitted to these Michaels back in '77. And up here at the front, we still have the original Mico triple clamps and front forks. And once again, for 1977, these forks were quite acceptable. Of course, they weren't up to today's standards, but nevertheless, they did a decent job for their time. And here at the back, it's again a replacement set of shocks, and John's opted to use a nice pair of Dutch-made Riger units on this bike. And once more, a closer look at this replacement fuel tank, because John told me that the tank that came with this bike was in absolutely pristine condition, and it was fully original as well, so John didn't want to damage it while he was racing, so he's opted to change it and put this alloy replacement in on the bike instead. But there were so many machines at this year's Kendal Classic Revival Scramble, it was quite hard to get around each and every one, and these few that we're going to be taking a look at in the Paddock videos are just a lucky few that we managed to capture over the course of the Saturday and the Sunday. And this bike of John Kemp's is just one of the lucky machines that we managed to capture. But again, look out for John racing this bike in the pre-1978 class when we eventually get round to posting all of the racing footage from this year's Scramble. So there you have it, a very nice example of a 1977 AW 400 Mico, and that bike there belongs to John Kemp. Okay, moving swiftly along now. This is another cracker of a bike that I came across on the Saturday, and this is a Honda CR480 twin shocker that was built by Jem Parker. Now, we have featured many bikes of Jem's here on my channel in the past, and you may remember that we featured a nice big CCM at the 2023 Kendal Classic Revival Scramble, and that bike was also built by Jem. But this bike here, I think, is based on a 1983 monoshock 480 Honda, and this, of course, has been reconfigured for twin shock racing, but most of the bike is based around the geometry of the mighty 490 Mico. But I'm sure you don't need me to tell you about how potent these 482-stroke Honda engines are. An absolute belter of a motor, and it fits quite nicely into this 83 chassis, which, as I said, most of the back end of this bike has been configured along the geometry of the 490 Mico. And you can see we have a key-in flat slide carburetor feeding that fuel into that Honda motor through that V-Force 3 reed valve block assembly. Now, the exhaust pipe on this engine is again been taken from a 490 Mico, but this has been slightly modified to fit the 480 Honda engine and, of course, around that Honda chassis. And again, I'm pretty sure that this fuel tank has been taken from one of the earlier Honda models, an alloy fuel tank, of course, with those nice Honda HRC graphics on them as well. Now, as far as I know, the front end on this Jem Parker bike is still the 1983 Honda forks and hub, and these forks have, of course, been upgraded with these nice plastic protectors to prevent stones and other kind of debris from damaging the bottom of the fork stanchions. And again, here at the back we have a modified alloy swing arm, and this swing arm would probably originally have been the monoshock swing arm, which has then been modified to take these twin shocks, one at either side of the swing arm. But as I said, the geometry at the back of this bike is based around the Mega 490 Micro. And here at the back of the bike, the rear suspension is made up of a pair of very high quality YSS piggyback gas shocks, which of course are a replacement to the original monoshock that would have been used on this swing arm. But these YSS units are very popular with riders who race these twin shock hybrids. But yet again, another very interesting hybrid twin shocker, built of course by Jem Parker. And this is a bike that I think we'll take a much closer look at in a future video here on my channel, so look out for that. But again, another belter of a machine, this 480 Honda from Jem Parker. Now, these were another couple of old timers that I came across during my Paddock walkabout, and these pair of KTMs are Mike Walker's 1974 250s. Now, I did learn on the day that the white bike in the background there was Mike's race machine, and this red example here in the foreground was basically a standby or even a substitute spares bike. But these old KTMs are another model that you very seldom see racing at classic events these days, so it was quite nice to bump into this couple of gems here in the paddock. But as I remember, I think these 250 KTM two-stroke piston port engines were pretty good power plants back in the 1970s, and of course fueled by that big Bing carburetor. And these KTM 250 two-stroke engines are not unlike the Micro engines of their day, with that quite large cylinder fin area, and of course those radial fins there on the cylinder head, just to try and keep that two-stroke engine cool. But it's good to see these old KTMs out and about, because as I said, you don't see too many of them taking part in motocross racing these days. But on the back of Mike's spare bike here, you can see he's got a pair of Italian Marzocchi piggyback shocks in that laid down configuration. So quite a nice looking old bike, and not fully original, I don't think, but as I said, this is Mike's go-to spare bike, or his spare parts department should anything happen to this machine here, which is Mike's current race machine. Which I do remember being told that the fuel tank on this bike is not the original one for this particular bike, but nevertheless another nice looking old timer from the 1970s, which, it has to be said, it does appear at first glance to have most of its original parts, apart of course from that replacement fuel tank, but it still has the proper wheels, forks and seat and handlebars for its time period. It even has the proper stock original KTM exhaust and tailpipe that it had from 74. And there was certainly a good variation of different makes and models of bikes at this year's Revival Scramble, some of which, of course, you're going to take a look at in these up and coming videos, but there was plenty old classics for people to take a look at this year, and in these featured videos you're only going to be scratching the surface of what was available on the day. But it was a alloy fuel tank on this bike and not the original fiberglass tank that would have been fitted onto this little KTM, but nevertheless it has all the proper handlebars from 1974 with again that crossbar welded on and not using clamps as they use in these modern times. Once again, the original exhaust is still fitted to Mike's race bike, which is a very rare thing to see on one of these old vintage racers. But as you can see, this old girl here has certainly had a bit of a hard life, which is what you'd expect on a bike that's now 50 years old. So well done once again to Mike for keeping it out there on the track. And this is another old classic that you can see taking part in the pre-1978 class when we eventually get round to posting all the racing footage from this event, which will be coming up immediately after we've completed our second Paddock walkabout. But there you go, another nice pair of vintage classics from Mike Walker. But as we move on, this is another nice classic that I spotted on the Saturday evening. Now, this bike here is Adam Tabret's 1983 KTM 560 four-stroke thumper, another big bruiser of a bike, and certainly very quick, because I watched this bike in action on the track on the Sunday, and it was very quick indeed around this Revival Scramble racetrack. So again, you can see this bike taking part in the Twin Shock Open 45 age group and over, so look out for Adam strutting his stuff on this big four-stroke Rotax thumper. But here we have the business end of the bike with that Rotax single cylinder, but the twin port cylinder head, an absolute bruiser of a bike, very reliable and very quick. And again, these big Rotax four-stroke thumpers are not everybody's choice of motocross machine, basically because they're quite a heavy lump to throw around the track, but in terms of their speed and power, these are pretty awesome machines. Plastic fuel tank, of course, as per the 1980s. Almost all these kind of motocrossers in the 1980s were by now using plastic fuel tanks rather than steel or alloy. Here at the front end, we have a pair of Marzocchi conventional forks. These are the later model of Marzocchis. Quite substantial looking suspension units, as you can see, and the dual or twin leading shoe front brake on this bike as well. And I do believe that the wheels are new, which have been relaced onto the hub with new spokes. And here at the back end of Adam's Rotax Thumper, we have a square box section alloy swing arm with, of course, those twin shocks bolted onto either side. Now, these Falcon piggybacks are quite good suspension units, because I had a similar pair to these on the back of my old 1980 440 Michael back in the day, and I always found these shocks to be very good and of decent quality. But I can just imagine the sound that comes out of this megaphone silencer when that big Rotax engine gets fired into life. And that KTM racing seat there, where it creeps up the rear of the fuel tank so that the rider can move his weight from the back of the bike right up to almost sitting on front of the fuel tank. So again, this is another bike to look out for on the track when Adam races it in the Twin Shock Open 45 years and over class. That's, of course, 45 years and over for the rider, and not 45 years and over for the age of the machine. But another belter of a bike, Adam Tabret's KTM 4-stroke Thumper. Right, so just to conclude this part one of our Revival Scramble Paddock walkabout, we're going to take a look at this quite interesting 1981 Kramer EX 410. Now, this was a bike that I came across during my walkabout, and the owner did tell me that he just recently bought this bike, but he was a bit unsure as to if this was a 1982 or possibly even an earlier 1981 bike. But I don't actually know myself, but my view is that this bike here will be a 1981 bike, because it appears to have some kind of suspension modification done at the rear, whereby the twin shocks that are normally fitted onto this bike have been replaced by a single monoshock. But as you can see, that superb, unbreakable Rotax two-stroke engine, and as you know, these engines were used in a multitude of different makes and models of bikes in the 1970s and 1980s, and most especially the old Can-Am bikes from back in the day. So for Kramer, this was a good choice of engine to put into the chassis. And in this shot here, you can see that rear suspension linkage modification, which does look like it's a possible homemade conversion, because normally the linkage that's bolted onto the back of this bike would have two twin shocks in this configuration here at the rear. But as you can see, with that linkage, this has been converted to a single monoshock instead. But again, a nice steel swing arm on the back, and I think the wheels and the spokes on this bike are also brand new, so those are not the original wheels and spokes for that particular year. And here at the front of the bike, we have the gas and oil remote reservoir for that single rear shock. Of course, on the normal 1981 bike, it wouldn't have this particular part. And here at the front end of our EX 410 Kramer, we have a set of Italian-made Marzocchi front forks, which again were quite common on these German-made Kramers back in the early 1980s. And also here at the front, we have the standard front drum brake, which was quite good as far as I remember. And even for an old drum brake system, these stoppers worked quite well. Once more, plastic fuel tanks, of course, on this 1981 bike. As I said, most European 1980s machines were beginning to swap from the steel or alloy fuel tanks to these much cheaper and easier to produce, and of course much lighter plastic fuel tanks. And this one is sort of semi-translucent as well, so you can see how much fuel is actually inside. But this bike here is another one that we are going to add to the list for a more in-depth feature in a later video here on my channel. So if you like your Kramer two-strokers, then make a point of tuning in to take a look at that. But another fantastic machine from the Paddock at this year's 2024 Kendal Classic Revival. So that wraps up part one of our Paddock video walkabout. Now, if you retune to my channel, these are some of the bikes that you're going to see in part two, and we have a nice selection of old classics for you to take a look at. So if you're not already a subscriber to CDB TV, then I do hope you will do that very small thing in order that you don't miss out in this next selection of bikes from around the Paddock. So once again, thanks very much for taking the time to tune in to my channel. And like I said, these are the bikes that you're going to be taking a look at when we continue with part two.